1,000 sorrows teaches a man to preach. That's not from the book of Proverbs, that's what John Piper said. So, though I want to hear what John means by that, I think you and I, Don, ought to respond. I think it's a tremendously important principle. So, how do you understand that? 1,000 sorrows teaches a man to preach.
I'm happy to affirm it after I've put in a caveat first. My ingrown tendency to complexify. There is a sense in which you want people to say preachers must be shaped regardless of their level of maturity, regardless of how many things they've suffered, regardless of anything else, they're shaped by the Word. They have to be students of the Word first. What teaches them to preach is, first of all, the Bible itself and good models. So I want to put all of those things, and I know that you would say the same thing. I'm not taking away anything that from what you've said. I just want to make sure that's clear and presupposed among us.
Good.
But then after that, suffering, but also joys, are part of human experience that enable us to interact with people more knowledgeably. And then suffering in particular brings us to an end of ourselves. And therefore it makes us rely more on God. It makes us more empathetic and compassionate with respect to the people to whom we're ministering. There's less likely to be angry young man syndrome. And in any case, it should also fit into the bigger matrix of living under the cross, suffering even for Christ's sake, but suffering as part of this fallen, damned world before the end, and thus taking up in ourselves something in some small way of the sorrows of Christ. All of those things are likely to deepen us in terms of how we say things, how we see people, how we view Christ, what we need of grace, and so on. All of that must, with time, give us more depth, more penetration, more affective elements in our preaching.
Yeah, when I love the saying, and of course Don's right, no proposition can get everything in there. So obviously it's not only sorrows that teach us how to preach, obviously. It's the Word itself teaches how to preach. But I remember years ago in my first church, I had a young man who was, he actually was an X-ray technician, or at least and he would walk patients through a particularly painful procedure where they had to fill themselves with a certain kind of fluid, and then he said, come over here, come over here, come over here. And then after about 5 years of this, he himself had to go through the procedure, and he hated it. And he told me, it's changed my life. He says, I will never treat patients the way I used to treat them. Was always kind of impatient with them.
That's right.
I'm absolutely sure that also holds for preaching, that there's a tendency, I think, until we have been through the furnace, through the ringer, for us to take the Word of God and maybe apply it with a tone or with a speed or with a demeanor that is actually like that X-ray technician before he actually went through it himself. Also, by the way, I think I also think this means that pastoring sets up your preaching. I remember I'd only been in the ministry about 3 or 4 months when a young man in my church died. His wife, I saw him die. His wife turned to me and said, I cannot possibly tell my 9 and 10-year-old sons about this. Would you please do it? Would you get there? Go right now. They're waiting, and I can't call them. I want you to tell them, because I don't have the ability to break the news. So I drove there and sat down with them and went through it. It changed my preaching. I mean, I'd never been through anything like that.
What did it do?
Well, it was a little bit like it was kind of vicarious suffering. In other words, even though I hadn't gone through it, I felt their suffering in a way I've never felt somebody suffering before, because I was being asked to be the bearer of the tidings, then I had to try to comfort them from the Scripture. And the word became a little bit less just a set of information, a bunch of informational propositions, and became more like a balm, or it became more like a power to me. I also think, by the way, there's another kind of suffering that just changed me, and that is mortification. The suffering of painful self-examination, dealing with your own sin, seeing yourself not respond to your own exhortations and having to come back and exhort yourself again. Preaching to yourself, applying the law and grace to your own heart. That's another kind of suffering that actually makes you a better preacher. And it's a suffering that we can all go out and do any day you want. You don't have to wait for something bad to happen. You can just really come to grips with the things that your wife's been telling you about, or your husband's been telling you about, or your parents been telling you about for years, and you just haven't taken them seriously. Indwelling flesh. So I think you don't have to wait for thyroid cancer or prostate cancer or something like that to come into your life and before you become a good preacher. I just don't want anybody to think that that's what you have to wait for, though that actually is a wonderful help.
Your caveat about wanting to say the Word teaches us to preach, so let's make sure that doesn't get overlooked. What I had in mind was how it is that some people look at this Word, understand the Word in the same way, and some can apply it with enormous power, and others can't. And Psalm 119 says, verse 71, "It was good for me that I was afflicted, that I might understand your word." So it is a hermeneutical device. Luther, what he called it, tentatio, oratio, meditatio, tentatio, where he's prayer, meditation, and suffering are the three ways to understand the Bible. That's what I had in mind. So it's not like here's suffering and here's the word, but here's the word. Are you moved? Can you see anything horrible or glorious here? Probably not if you've never tasted glory, never tasted horror. Like Lewis said, I look to you because you're the Lewis lover. Lewis said the word glory would have been nothing but a low, small thing had I never seen certain crags and cliffs and mountains, and probably referring to the Alps. And that's the way it is with the Bible is just filled with weighty, heavy, painful possibilities. And if you're just a chipper, person, what are you going to do with all that? And the Lord knows how to make you unchipper. He will bring something, and you know the kind of sufferings I have in mind are not mainly cancer. I'm talking relationships mainly.
Sure, betrayals.
Relationships are what destroy you in the ministry. Anybody can survive cancer, for goodness sakes, but a broken marriage or a child or a betrayal in the ministry or these things are just devastating. And if you come through that and you start looking at the Bible again, you'll read Judas differently, right? You'll read Peter's denial differently. You'll read so many things differently. And when I say read them differently, okay, now I'm going to buy your caveat again. Exegesis tells you how to get proper meaning, but feeling what's there. And that's what preaching is. Preaching is exulting over what's there. It's taking the pain or the glory of what's there and just pressing it into the hearts of the people. And if you don't feel it, you're probably not going to do that.
I agree with all of that, although I do, and I take away the word although, because it's not a caveat, it's an additional thing. I once scanned the whole New Testament as quickly as I could just to pick up all of the explicit places where the text spoke of Christian suffering. And it was a very high percentage that was bound up with persecution. Or not necessarily violence, but as in Matthew 5:12, when men speak ill of you and revile you and say all terrible things against you for my sake. And to my mind, that is hugely salutary in your preaching as well. To return to a text like Acts 5:41, they rejoiced because they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. And because so much of American culture, until fairly recently, has had a huge Christian streak in it, therefore it has encouraged many of us wrongly to think that being on top of the culture and being admired and honored in the culture is our due. Whereas in fact, it's not only an exception historically, it's also a trap. And so the way things are falling out now, means that Christians have to change the way they think about the kind of suffering that erupts in a culture where you're despised, or where you're viewed as an ignoramus, or where you can't get a certain job, or you're not promoted. And we may not be that far around the corner from having to go to jail or whatever. And I think that will reinforce a whole lot of things in our preaching. Right. Living with eternity's values in view, learning how to die well, bearing shame gladly, rejoice because you're counted worthy to suffer for the name. And that is going to introduce a lot of changes in our preaching. Yeah. And in part, I first became sensitized to that because I was brought up in Quebec. And people like my dad in the early 50s spent a total of 8 years in jail for preaching the gospel. So I was not brought up with a sense of entitlement. And now I see that sense of entitlement being lost in America. And that's, in my view, a good thing.
Yeah. I can tell by your body language it's time to quit. But I've got to pick up on a word there. Okay. Please. Acts 5:41, they rejoiced and suffered gladly. I don't want this conversation on 1,000 sorrows make a preacher mean 1,000 sorrows make a preacher sad, and therefore sad preachers are better preachers. That's totally not what I mean. Because joy, what's missing in this culture is not happiness or glib, rah-rah kind of funny, let's all have fun. I'm so sick of that word. But rather, in the face of cancer, in the face of betrayal, joy in the face of 8 years of a father's imprisonment, a radiance that makes the world say, what's that?
Important final note.